Professor Sharat Sunder R is a conservation architect and history enthusiast currently working at the Department of Architecture, College of Engineering, Trivandrum. As the author of the King's Craftsmen, History of the Ivory Carvers of Thiruvananthapuram, which was published in 2016 by KCHR, the book documents the history of the extinct craft of ivory carving in Kerala. He also involved in research on the vernacular and traditional architectural history of Kerala. Professor Sharat Sunder was also a regular columnist with The Hindu. His writings focus on the history, art, architectural, and cultural heritage of Travancore can be found in the blog Trails from Travancore. Currently, he is working on a book which documents the life and times of the artists involved in the Travancore Royal Atelier. In his conservation architect, Professor Sharat Sunder conducts curated heritage walks in the historic fort area of Thiruvananthapuram, and during 2017-19, he was a member of the conservation committee for Sri Padmanabha Swami Temple constituted by the Honorable Supreme Court of India. Before starting the program, the audience are requested to keep your microphones on mute for the duration of the presentation. Please type in your queries and comments in the chat box. We will read them out at the end of the presentation. I invite Professor Arunima, Director of KCHR, to present.
It gives me enormous pleasure. I'm truly delighted to welcome Sharat Sunder Rajiv to a KCHR seminar. Hello, Sharat. Unfortunately, we have never met in person before, but I'm really happy that we could at least begin our acquaintance virtually. I first encountered the King's Craftsmen when I was a scholar in residence at KCHR a couple of years ago. And as part of a larger work on religion in Kerala, I began some work on the history of Trivandrum. And one of my colleagues in KCHR told me, "Have you seen this book?" and handed me the King's Craftsmen. I have to say that, I had seen Sharat's pieces in the Hindu and in other places, and I hadn't made the connection between the book and the person who used to write those pieces. But the book is exquisitely written. It brings together a range of concerns. I mean, of course, it is about the ivory craftsmen. So there is obviously a very, very rich and detailed and insightful discussion about craft itself and the histories of people, some of whom are actually members of his own ancestral family. And so there's a very fascinating kind of narration of questions about labor and caste, in some instances, questions about gender, but also just a very, a very nuanced understanding of the relationship between work and history and what actually one, understands as the making of an artwork. And these are people who were clearly artists of the very highest stature. So the book is actually, I cannot recommend it enough. It is an absolutely stunningly well-written book. It is also extremely important, given the fact that many of us are interested in labor histories, but this tells that story from a very different point of view. So welcome, Sharat, and we greatly look forward to your talk today. I wish I had known earlier, and I would have pushed you to speak a little, maybe in the question and answer, you could talk to us a little bit about the ivory skeleton and, those kinds of interests that you have, and also questions about conservation and, wearing your other hat, not just as a history enthusiast, but also as an architect. So welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you. So, I have a presentation. Can I share my screen now?
Yes, absolutely.
Can someone please tell me whether the slides are moving? Is it going to the next slide?
Now it's not moving, but it's visible.
Okay, only the first slide is visible.
Yeah.
Just give me a second.
Yeah, now the slides are moving. The second slide is displayed on the screen.
Is it visible now?
Yes.
Yes, it is.
The second slide is visible?
Yeah, now
Yes.
it is visible in the full screen. Okay.
Okay. So thank you for the kind words, Arunima ma'am. So first of all, I would like to thank KCHR for their kind invitation to speak about the book, The King's Craftsmen, which was published way back in 2016 by KCHR. And yeah, before I go to the presentation, let me tell you how I have structured today's presentation. So basically, I was in a fix because when I revisited the book and the topics discussed there, I found out that there are many things to discuss, and it's very difficult to include everything in an 1 hour talk. So here I am just focusing on few themes. Basically, I would like to start with my personal experience. As you have rightly mentioned, that some of the craftsmen uh, who appear in this book are my ancestors. So regarding the major craft guilds that were there in Thiruvananthapuram, certain members were my ancestors, family members. So it was uh, a quest to find the artistic heritage of my family and my ancestors that made me write this book. So what was the methodology that I followed for this book, and how I have compiled information, and how I am still engaged with this project? That section I would like to share with you. Then I would like to introduce all of you to the star craftsmen, some of the most renowned ivory carvers of Travancore, their contributions, some of the objects they have made. And then the third and last section will be on the institutions that had played an important role in shaping the life of these craftsmen. Okay, so whatever topics that are remaining, if there are questions, we can handle those in the last question answer session. So I will move to the next slide. So here you can see the book, The King's Craftsman. So the story of this book is also the story of a young boy who, as I mentioned, that is my story. I was on a quest to find out the artistic heritage of my family. So speaking of artistic heritage, I come from a family of artists, painters. My great grandfather was a painter at the royal court, one of the last Darbar artists of Travancore. And therefore, I grew up seeing a lot of paintings, original artworks. There were oleographs of Raja Ravi Verma Press. So it was a wonderful time seeing all these great artworks, reproductions, copies, prints. But I did not know that my family had an association with ivory carving. So once I went to the attic, and it was in the attic of the old ancestral house that I came across certain tools that were used for carving timber, and there were others used for working on ivory. Of course, then I did not know that those were tools used to carve on ivory. And I also saw bits and pieces of ivory and pieces of timber with some carvings and all those things. I was most interested, and I would say that I had a mind that was receptive to such things from the past, and I liked hearing stories. In fact, my book itself starts with a quote from Joseph Campbell, the mythologist. Everything starts with a story. So the quest started with such a story, and the story was narrated to me by one of my great aunts. And the story starts from uh, this lamp. You, in this slide, you see a photograph of a lamp, a hanging lamp, uh, probably made sometime during 1850s or 60s. It was there in one of the dark rooms in the ancestral house. And while narrating several stories about my ancestors, I came across this particular lamp, and on it was engraved this name. For those who do not uh, know to read Malayalam, it is written Cherunellil Kaliyamma Vaga, meaning it belonged to Kaliyamma of Cherunellil. So I had no clue who this Kaliyamma was, or where was this Cherunellil. Is that a name of a place or a family? I had no clue. So I asked my seniors, the elders in the family. Some of them told me that you go to Kadakyavur and there you will find Cherunellil. So I went there and I managed to find out the old house. And that is the starting point of this book. Because when I went there, I was exposed to all these stories of the craftsmen of my ancestors who lived during the 1850s, late 19th centuries. And there were stories of these craftsmen who would travel every day to Thiruvananthapuram. And at some point, they found it very difficult to make that journey every day, so that they decided to come and settle in Thiruvananthapuram. This took place in 1860. So probably this lamp came to our ancestral house, which was there in Manakad, Thiruvananthapuram, sometime during 1860s. Then from the same attic, I got several records, family papers and documents written on palm leaf records, dating from 1870s, of containing the details of my great-great-grandfather purchasing the property with an old house in it. So that was the same house, the ancestral house, which had been rebuilt and expanded, but that was still in existence during that time. So the house itself told me many stories. The scattered records told me many stories, and the story of this book started from there. So initially, as a student, I was interested in these things. And at that point, I never thought of compiling it into a book. But I did have the habit of keeping journals. And in fact, what you see here is the cover page of one of the journals, which I think I gave a copy of this manuscript to KCHR Library sometime in 2007. And it was listed in the library catalog. So it is titled Our Family History from 1850s to 1980s. By then, I did not have the idea of focusing on to the history of Ivory Carvers or ivory carving in Trivandrum. It was just the history of my family, its branches. But I had a flair for illustrating the book. So whenever I came across a particular very interesting incident, I would go down, I would take my tools, the rotring pen, pencil, and then I would make such drawings. But this was meant for private circulation. By that time, I never thought of publishing or compiling the information and getting it published as a book. So this is the first form of the manuscript that I had produced after doing some primary research, interviewing the senior members of the family, etc. And a few years later, around 2010, I came across Jenny, that is the genealogy website, and Jenny was most useful for my research because whatever information I had managed to collect, at one point it was so difficult for me to compile everything. The family history itself, when I went deep down to the history, there were many branches. So initially I used to write down all the details and relationships and how people were connected. All these things were written down, but then it became very, very difficult to maintain the record. But then Jenny came to help. So I used Jenny as a platform to create the family genealogy chart, and along with that, what you see here is the uh, profiles. That is, in Jenny, you can actually create a profile for each person whose data you will be entering into the software. So you see information, you see the profiles of various people, ancestors who were born. On the extreme left, you see Ananda Padmanabhan Achari, who we will be discussing about, was born around 1800. Then Bhagavati Ammal, 1893, and another person who was born in 1888. Okay, so Jenny offered this platform, and I fed in all the information to Jenny. And through Jenny, I was able to connect with many other people who were doing research on the craft guilds. And I was also able to connect with my relatives. I did not know that many of them had already made profiles in Jenny. They had a family tree made in Jenny. And when I got into Jenny, it was so easy for me to connect with them. So that was the beginning. And at this point too, I did not have that idea of bringing out a book from the information that I had collected. So this was the kind of research that was done initially. And a few things I would like to mention at this point is that the craftsmen community, that is the Vishwakarma community, who were primarily engaged with carving, ivory carving or carpentry work, they were a patrilineal community. And therefore, it was very difficult to come across information regarding the female family members. Male family members, it was relatively easy because male members of the family were remembered, their names were registered in the land deeds. So there was some kind of information available on the male family members, but the female family members, it was very hard to come by. The details were very hard to come by. And while doing this research, in fact, I was very much interested in collecting information about the female family members. Why? Because I have come across several craftsmen who contributed greatly towards ivory carving, but never did I come across the name of a single woman that was who was associated with ivory carving. There were few references to from the oral record. There were few references made on some female member who was good in drawing, painting, or even the nuances of carving, but they never practiced. Okay, so whatever information was available on the female family members, I had managed to collect and collate in Jenny. So that was the platform that I had been using. And even today, I am feeding in information that I get in Jenny, because even today, I am involved with this same project, and many people connect to me through Jenny. So now we will move to the next section of the presentation, where we will be looking at the contributions made by some of the important craftsmen I have encountered during my research. So ivory carving was practiced in India since very ancient times. And with regard to Kerala, or coming down to Thiruvananthapuram, there are some very interesting references from 14th century, because we have Anantapura Varnanam, which was composed in 14th century CE. And in Anantapura Varnanam, there is a beautiful description of a village market, which was located somewhere on the eastern side of Padmanabha Swami temple. So in that description, we find that ivory artifacts or small toys or objects made of ivory was available for sale in the market. But apart from that, we do not get any information about the craftsmen who were associated with the making of these objects. We also get to see that some of the temple collections had objects made of ivory. But again, no information about the craftsmen. So I searched in the Matilagam records, that is the records kept maintained by Sri Padmanabha Swami temple. We have records from 13th century CE. There was very little information about this particular craft or craftsman. There were many references on the carpenter class and several people who were involved in the construction of Padmanabha Swami temple at different times. And there were also references to people who made the ceremonial bow, the Onavilla, as we know it today. So there were details regarding the craftsman community, but nothing with respect to the ivory craftsmen. So the details regarding the ivory craftsmen were not available easily, and I continued my search, and it was in the Huzur records from the archives that I came across certain details. And these details came from 19th century onwards, and that too from the time of Swathi Tirunal. You see Swathi Tirunal here. It's a painting by August Theodor Schift, a Hungarian painter who came to Swathi's court. And as all of us know, Swathi Tirunal was a great patron of arts. And he was known as the Sharaboji of Travancore, because there was Sarfoji or Sharaboji, the Maharaja of Tanjavur, who was the greatest patron of artists, musicians, and performers in the south. But soon after Sarfoji passed away, his court disintegrated, and many of the people who were associated with Sharaboji's court came down to Travancore. And Swathi Tirunal was here. And it is from the same time that we get references of the earliest ivory craftsmen or the guilds which were there in Thiruvananthapuram. So here you see on the left side, Ananda Padmanabhan Achari, that is the title. His actual name was Kochukunya Achari, a native of Navai Kulam, who came down to Swathi's court during 1830s. So the record that I encountered in the Huzur records told me that Kochu Kunya Achari, who is recorded as a man from Navaikulam, had made a swarbat, a musical instrument for Swati Thirunal, and he presented the same to Swati. This happened in 1836, and he was given a Veera Sringala, a bangle of honor by the Maharaja. But it is not a ivory swarbat that he had made. The same record mentioned that there was another man by the name Narayanan. I don't know anything about Narayanan. Only his name is mentioned in the record. So Narayanan also on the same day presented Maharaja Swati Thirunal with a swarbat, but that was made of ivory. And he too got a bangle of honor. So initially it was not very clear, because whenever I asked the senior members of these guilds, the crafts guilds, they would tell you that Ananda Padmanabhan Achari, Kochu Kunyachari, was the first ivory carver who was there in Swati Thirunal's court. And in fact, there are many interesting stories about how he was introduced to the craft. He had been a carpenter, and once the Maharaja, according to the oral sources, once the Maharaja called him to Darbar, and a piece of ivory was placed before him, and the Maharaja asked Kochugunya whether he would be able to carve the figure of an elephant according to some sources, but other sources mentioned that it was a figure of a Ganapati that the Maharaja wanted Kochugunyu to carve out of it. So he did not know how to carve in ivory. The tools he had were the ones used by the carpenters, but then he somehow managed to carve the figure and presented it before the Maharaja. So that, according to the members of the Crafts Guild, is how Kochukunya became one of the most favorite craftsmen in the royal court. And therefore, he is considered as the father of ivory carving in Travancore court during 19th century. But I should tell you that still I don't know from where Kochugunya mastered the craft of ivory carving. But I do believe that the craft of ivory carving was practiced in Travancore or in the south by many craftsmen, because even before the time of Kochukunyachari, we do come across several references of people engaged in carving and creating artifacts in ivory. So it is possible that a craftsman would have come from Mysore or even Tanjavur court or some other neighboring state, and he would have taught Kochukunyachari the nuances of the craft. And that mystery man who is mentioned in the records, Narayanan, we don't know, but possibly there would have been some kind of connection between Narayanan and Kochukunyachari. And I do think that maybe they were siblings. We will come back to this later, because we do have certain other records from 1850s which tells us that there were several craftsmen and they were siblings who were working at the Travancore court. So that is Ananda Padmanabhan Achari, and on the right side you see Neelakantan Achari, Ananda Padmanabhan Kochukunyachari's son, who was born in 1830 and passed away in 1907, quite a reputed ivory craftsman of his times. And regarding these craftsmen, Ananda Padmanabhan Achari is remembered today as the craftsman who made the golden chariot and the ivory throne. So by ivory throne, you should not be confused, because there is a very famous ivory throne that was made during 1850s. That was presented to Queen Victoria. But this ivory throne that you see here is the one housed in the Puthan Maliga Palace Museum, that is Kudira Maliga. And this throne was crafted in 1831, and it was made for Maharaja Swati Tirunal. So from where did Maharaja Swati Tirunal get this idea of creating such a state throne? The idea probably came from Tanjavur, because if you look at the records and the artworks that are still in existence in the royal collection in Travancore, royal family's collection, you will see several miniature paintings of the Tanjavur Maharajas seated in similar ivory thrones, being popular with the Maharajas here. And if you look at the records, even the records indicates that this particular throne was crafted by native craftsmen, the craftsmen of Travancore, but it was being supervised by a native of Tanjavur. So there is a Tanjavur connection here. And as I mentioned before, this throne was made in 1831 for Swati Tirunal, and it was subsequently used by the later Maharajas of Travancore till Sri Moolam Tirunal, Ramavarma. And on the right side, you see a detail of the intricately carved side panel of the ivory throne. If you look carefully, you can see the conch shell insignia of the Travancore royal family, and flanking it, you see two lions carrying flags and winged figures blowing trumpets, and in the lower side, you see several scrolls, flora motifs, and even a very interesting motif of a pineapple. So, Kochukunya Achari and his guild was associated with the construction of this throne for Maharaja Swati Tirunal, and then he was associated with the construction of the golden chariot. So this golden chariot, the image on top is an engraving from Swati Tirunal's time, possibly from 1940s. It shows the Maharaja going out on a state procession, and below you see a photograph from 1935 showing the last Maharaja of Travancore, Chitra Tirunal Balarama Varma, going out to Shastamangalam for the Shastamangalam procession in the same chariot. So these two artifacts created by Kochukunyachari and his team were very important, because one was a state throne that was used by the Maharajas from Swati Tirunal to the last Maharaja, and likewise you have a state chariot, the golden chariot, that was made by the same group of craftsmen. But what is sad is that the Huzur records mention each and every detail about the construction of these items. You get to know from where the gold leaves used for gilding came, various other parts of this chariot were sourced from different companies and made by different people. All those information you will get from the Huzur records, but there is nothing regarding the craftsmen. Their names are not mentioned in these records. But from where do we get these records? That is interesting, because after Swati Tirunal, Swati Tirunal's younger brother, Uttram Tirunal Martanda Varma, comes to the throne, and here you see two paintings by court painters of Uttram Tirunal Martanda Varma. On the left, you see the state portrait showing him seated on the very same ivory throne made by Kochugunya and his team for Swathi Tirunal, his elder, the Maharaja's elder brother. And on the right, you see the Maharaja in a Western attire. And according to historians, Uttram Tirunal Martanda Varma was possibly the first Maharaja of Travancore um, uh, who was very comfortable in mingling with the Europeans. And he liked everything European. But deep down, if you go through his life and the records, but deep down, he was an Orthodox man. He was very Orthodox. We get to know this because this is an artifact he had commissioned. And this ivory skeleton, which was made sometime around 1852-53, is now housed in the Natural History Museum in the Napier Museum complex. And this artifact has a very interesting story. Now, the Maharaja, whom we had seen here, Uttram Tirunal Martanda Varma, was an Anglophile, and he, with the help of the Europeans at court, learned the European ways, and he learned the ways of a European physician, and he used to treat people. Now, that is not surprising because a few decades back, if you look at Tanjavur, Sarfoji Maharaja, the Sharaboji Maharaja, used to treat people. He was greatly interested in science and collected books, and he made notes, and everything is preserved in the library there in Tanjavur. So if you look at the Maharajas of Travancore and the connection Travancore had with Mysore princely state and Tanjavur princely state and Pudukkottai, there was a lot of exchange taking place between these kingdoms. And Sarfoji was in fact a person whom the other royals had looked upon. So certainly Uttram Tirunal Martanda Varma knew about Sarfoji. And what is interesting is that Sarfoji had in fact commissioned a European firm to make an ivory for his use, for his study purpose in ivory. But he commissioned Europeans to make the skeleton. But what happened in Tanjavur is that the European craftsmen, they found it too hard to carve the details in ivory, and therefore they sought the Maharaja's permission and made another skeleton in wood. But here in Travancore, we have this wonderful specimen made by the native craftsman. Now, how do we know that it was made by the native craftsman? Because in 1850s, Shanguni Menon, who had been the Diwan Peshkar of Travancore, writes a very detailed report to Madras government. And that report is about a few artifacts sent for an exhibition in Madras. And there he mentions that there is this guild of ivory carvers in Thiruvananthapuram. There are few brothers, he writes, and the eldest of the brothers is a man named Subramanian. Now I am yet to find out who this Subramanian is. But it clearly mentions that there were few craftsmen associated with the Maharaja's court, and they were the ones who had crafted the ivory throne and the ivory skeleton. And he also adds that this very skeleton was sent to Paris for an international exhibition. But why did the Maharaja go for an ivory skeleton? That is also interesting. Because the Maharaja, being a Kshatriya, if he touches an actual dead body or mortal remains or bones, he would then go through a cleansing ritual. So it was very difficult for Uttram Tirunal to use actual bones for his study, and therefore he commissioned the craftsmen to make this very detailed specimen in ivory. Another artifact that was commissioned by Uttram Tirunal Marthandavarma is this ivory state chair, which is now in the British Royal Collection. It is exhibited at Windsor Castle. And here you see a photograph of the state chair and the footstool from 1899. So when was this made and what's the history behind this particular artifact? So I hope all of you know about the great exhibition of 1851, known as the Great London Exhibition. Queen Victoria and the Prince Consort Albert, they were the masterminds behind this exhibition. And when word went out that the royals are going to conduct such a grand exhibition in England, all the Rajas in the Indian Maharajas were asked to send in their entries for the exhibition. And what did the Maharaja of Travancore send? Along with some other items, he sent this wonderful artifact, which is the ivory state chair. Now, the history of this ivory state chair goes a little beyond 1851 and the Great London Exhibition, because the records, the Huzur records, mention that this state chair was initially conceived and its construction was started sometime during late 1840s, and it was meant to be the state throne for Uttram Tirunal Marthandavarma, that is the Maharaja of Travancore. But then news came about this exhibition and the Maharaja decided to send the chair to London. He not only sends the chair, then later on he sends a letter to Queen Victoria requesting her to accept the state chair as a gift from Travancore. The Queen was more than happy to accept such a wonderful piece of art. And in fact, if you go through the journals of Queen Victoria, on the day the Great London Exhibition was inaugurated, she in fact mentions about this beautiful state chair. So this state chair again is a work done by the native craftsmen of Travancore. Now, after Swathi Tirunal and Uttram Tirunal Marthandavarma, those two Maharajas were great patrons of art, and Swathi Tirunal is greatly responsible for setting up a royal atelier and a workshop where he patronized the finest of the craftsmen and the finest of the artists. And now, coming to his successors, you see two of his nephews here, along with Raja Sarti Madhavrao, who was a Brahmin from Tanjavur, and he came to Travancore at a very young age, and he came as the tutor to the nephews of Swathi Tirunal and Uttram Tirunal Marthandavarma. And who were these nephews? You saw them on either side. Maharaja Ailyam Tirunal Ramavarma, who ruled from 1860 to 1880, and on the right you have Vishagam Tirunal Ramavarma, who ruled for 5 years from 1880 to 1885. So why do we have the pictures of these three persons here? Because if you look at the title of the book, it's titled The King's Craftsmen. Now, who are the King's Craftsmen? There were craftsmen who were associated with the royal court, who were associated with Padmanabha Swami temple, who were called in for periodic restoration works and other construction works. There were ordinary craftsmen, but there was a group of special craftsmen who are referred to as the King's Craftsmen, or the private employees of the royals. So from the time of Ailyam Tirunal, we get to see that the finest of the craftsmen worked for the Maharaja or the Ilayaraja, who is the heir apparent, or for the Diwan. And in this case, we do have records. We do have records of Neelakandan Ashari, who was the son of Kochugunya Ashari, working for Diwan Sarti Madhavrao and also for the royals. Now, this very interesting information comes from the research done by Priya Maholai Joradi, and in her book, she explores the art and craft associated with the royal court in Baroda, where Madhav Rao was placed as Diwan. And there we find records of Madhav Rao bringing craftsmen from Travancore as his private employees and employing them to make artifacts for him. And these artifacts, in fact, we have records of Neelakandan Achari going to Baroda as a private employee of Sarti Madhav Rao and making around 10 ivory artifacts that was later loaned to the Pune exhibition by Sarti Madhav Rao. So these craftsmen who were working for the royals and the aristocrats were not restricted to the Travancore court, but only a few privileged craftsmen got the chance to go out of the court to different princely states and work for patrons like this. The others were mostly confined or restricted to the courtly circle, and they were associated with local construction works, but not these star craftsmen or these very privileged craftsmen who were the king's craftsmen. So here we have an image of an ivory tankard that once belonged to Sarti Madhav Rao, and it was lent by Madhav Rao for an exhibition, and that is from where we get this photograph. This is a photograph from late 1880s. And here you can see that the body of this tankard is crafted in ivory, and you have silver also added to embellish the artifact. Now on the right side, if you look carefully, I hope you can make out the low relief carving here, where you can see the state chariot. This is the same chariot made by Kochugunyachari and his team. And it was made for Swati Tirunal Maharaja. So you see a little bit of the eastern Gopuram of Padmanabha Swami temple here on extreme right, and right in front of it you have the golden chariot and the procession with the howdah and all. That's a royal procession. So this is clearly a work from the royal atelier, from the guild of craftsmen who were associated with the royal court. Now, this photograph is also from late 19th century, and it presents a set of objects that was exhibited for an exhibition. And here you see, down here, you see an ivory comb that was lent by Sarti Madhav Rao. And what is most interesting is that a few years back, when I met one of the descendants of Sarti Madhav Rao, I showed her this photograph, and she was surprised actually, because she told me that the same comb is still there in the family collection. So the photograph mentioned the information that went with the photograph clearly mentions that it was lent for the exhibition by Sarti Madhav Rao, and you have it still preserved by his family members. Now we come to the next section of the presentation, where we will discuss the history of various institutions that shaped the life of these craftsmen, the ivory carvers of Travancore. Here you see a photograph from 1900 of the Industrial School of Arts, which is now the Fine Arts College in Thiruvananthapuram. We know that the Fine Arts College or the Industrial School of Arts was established during 1888. But the actual history of the Industrial School of Art starts from 1850s. Because if you look at the Huzur records, during the time of Swati Tirunal, he brought in several Europeans to work for him. And there was Alan Brown, who looked after the observatory. And if you go through the reports of Alan Brown, there is a reference from 1856. Alan Brown mentions that he wanted to create a school, an industrial school in Travancore, in Trivandrum. And he made necessary arrangements to procure the land, but unfortunately that idea didn't materialize. There were some problems, there were few people who did not like that idea. He gives us the details in the records, and his dream never materialized. But what we know from Huzur records is that even from 1860s, there was a Danda Apis. Now that is a vernacular term. Dandam means ivory, Apis is the corrected form of office, which was connected to the Huzur. That is the craftsmen who were handpicked by the royals. They were patronized by them, and they had a space. We don't know where they worked. Probably they had a workspace somewhere inside the Fort Palace complex, and they were sitting there making all these wonderful artifacts in ivory. But nevertheless, from 1860s, there was a Danda Apis, or an office for these craftsmen who were engaged in ivory carving. And it was the same Danda office, or the office, that eventually got transformed into the Industrial School of Arts. And the man responsible for that transformation is Kashi Narayana Iyer. You see his photograph on right. Kashi Narayana Iyer was an artist and a craftsman. He got into government service, but he did not like his first job. He was a policeman. He did not like his job. He was an artist. According to the descendants of Kashi Narayana Iyer, his talent was recognized by none other than Ramarao, the Diwan of Travancore. And Ramarao made arrangements to send Kashi Narayana Iyer to Madras School of Arts. And Narayana Iyer goes there, he studies there. There he learns the nuances of carving and casting in bronze. He also learns fine arts under Havel, E.B. Havel. And then he returns to Travancore in 1888 and restructures the old Danda Apis and establishes it as the Industrial School of Arts. So alongside the other trades like pottery, ivory carving, he introduced casting in bronze. And in fact, there are few specimens from 1890s still in some collections of the bust portraits cast in bronze, made under the supervision of Narayana Iyer. And he is also responsible for the introduction of a fine arts section in the school. Now, this photograph is from late 1930s. The man sitting in the center is Madhavan Unnithan, who was the superintendent of the School of Arts during 1930s and 40s. Why is this photograph important? Because I had mentioned that the Husur records tells us there was this Danda office, but we do not know where these craftsmen were stationed. But once the school is established, once the industrial school is established, they get a proper workshop. But unfortunately, we do not have a good photograph of that workshop. In the previous slide, you saw the facade of the School of Arts, the main building, but the craftsmen, they were not stationed in the main building. Actually, in this photograph on the left-hand side top, you see the section of a building with trellis work in bamboo, and that small workshop stood behind this grand building, right behind this grand building. And that was the workshop of the craftsmen, the Ivory Carvers. And regarding the artifacts produced in the School of Arts, these are the very typical artifacts that you will find produced there. There was a great demand for religious icons. So on top, you see the set consisting of Sri Rama, Bharata, Lakshman, Sita, and all. So that was very popular, and there was great demand. And below, you see on the right-hand side a small icon of Annapurneshwari or Annapurna Devi, which is also made in the Travancore, the Industrial School of Arts in Thiruvananthapuram. But what is interesting is that the period is 1880s, 1890s, and early 20th century, and the influence of Raja Ravi Verma was greatly felt during this period. And therefore, if you look carefully, on the left, you have the very popular lithograph of goddess Lakshmi wearing that pan-Indian attire, the sari, which was introduced by Raja Ravi Verma. And if you see the icon of the goddess Sita on the image that is on top, that is the very Indian kind of iconography and the detail that you would generally see. But here, in the Annapurna Devi icon, you see a sari, which is very, very similar to what we see in Ravi Verma paintings. So that kind of transformation or the influence of Ravi Verma played a great role in redefining the aesthetic perception of the Travancore craftsmen. The School of Arts produced wonderful artworks that were sent to exhibitions. And here you see a set of articles sent to the Delhi Darbar exhibition of 1903. And the casket that you see right in the center with this legend number 5 and this piece of Vishnu, these two pieces got gold medal in the Delhi Darbar exhibition. So this also tells you the kind of artifacts that was being produced in the School of Arts. Now focusing on the next generation of craftsmen, we saw Kochugunya Achari and we also saw Neelakantan Achari. And these are the children of Neelakantan Achari, 4 brothers. The eldest was Tanuvan, then Keshavan, Padmanabhan, and Ramakrishnan. These 4 brothers were employed in the Industrial School of Arts. Now, the early craftsmen, Kochukunju and Neelakandan, were not employees at the Industrial School of Arts. They were the king's craftsmen or the special hand-picked craftsmen patronized by the royals. They did have their workshops attached to their houses, and they took in commissions from aristocrats, but they primarily worked for the royal family. But with the establishment of the Industrial School of Arts, the old lifestyle began to change. And during the earlier generations, those craftsmen derived great pride in saying that they were employed in the royal atelier. But now, the children of Neelakandan Ashari, they took great pride in associating their names with the Industrial School of Arts. Because Industrial School of Arts by that time was known throughout India as a repository of the finest craftsmen that churned out some of the finest carvings in ivory. So these craftsmen were associated with the Industrial School of Arts, and moving forward, we see that the craft tradition that was once maintained by few families. If we go back to the report written by Shanguni Menon, he clearly mentions that there are few brothers associated with the ivory craft. What we can gather is that the secrets of the trade remained within the family circles. There were few guilds, related guilds or families who were practicing this trade, but outsiders were not encouraged to learn ivory carving. But things were changing with the establishment of Industrial School of Arts. Now that is a government institution, and irrespective of your caste and social standing, if you are eligible to learn the craft, then you can walk in and learn. Now things began to change. And we have people like Shilpa Ratnakara, N. Veluachari, FRSA, Fellow of the Royal Society. Coming from Kollam, he hailed from a very poor family in Kollam. And the ancestors of the family had settled in Thiruvananthapuram during 18th century, and they were associated with the construction activities around Thiruvananthapuram. Now, what is special about Veluachari is that he was a very ambitious person. He was a man with a vision. And he probably was the only craftsman of his times to write an autobiography. I had seen the few pages he had written, but unfortunately, it was never completed or published. But then again, he published a booklet that contains details from his autobiography. So what we learn about Veluachari is that he was introduced to the Maharaja of Travancore, Moolam Tirunal Ramavarma, by none other than the palace controller, the famous Shankaran Thampi. And once the Maharaja got an artifact, a curious artifact that is known as the Chinese ball, the Chinese puzzle ball. So you have many concentric circles, one inside the other, finely carved. And the Maharaja, when he got this, he called all his craftsmen and he showed them the wonderful artifact and asked them whether they can make a replica of it. So according to the published details from Veluachari's biography, none of the craftsmen managed to make a replica. And it was he, Velu Achari, who successfully completed the project and presented his work before the Maharaja. And the Maharaja was delighted and offered him a post in the Industrial School of Arts. So he was employed at the Industrial School of Arts, but for a brief period. He went back and he established his own Sri Moolam Fine Arts and Ivory Works and Institution in 1920. And this slide shows the book. You can see it here, Monument of Enterprise, that was published in 1940. And what you get to see inside the book is about the man himself, Velu Achari, and he carefully compiles the details of the medals and distinctions that his firm has won right from 1914 onwards. And then you have extracts from testimonials given by the people who purchased from his firm and who visited his firm. Now, even Mahatma Gandhi had visited Velu Achari's firm. And we also see that many of the dignitaries who used to visit Travancore, like even when Lord Wellington came to Travancore, Mrs. Wellington went to Velu Achari's firm to see the artifacts. So he certainly was a very, very ambitious man. And what is intriguing is that even though he was associated with the Industrial School of Arts during his early career, he broke away from that kind of context. And then in the later writings, we see him as an opponent of the Industrial School of Arts. And he even claims that the craftsmen who are employed in the Industrial School of Arts doesn't come anywhere near me or my craftsmen. And true to his words, we do find references of very fine craftsmanship coming from his workshop. For instance, this is the address presented to Sir C.P. Ramaswamy Iyer by the Syrian Catholics on the occasion of his 60th birthday, that is in 1939. You can see that it's an address written on gold plate and set in an ivory frame, intricately carved ivory frame with the insignia, the royal insignia on top. And on either side, it is flanked by the figurine of Saint Michael. And it is set on an ebony base, inlaid with ivory. And there is a plaque in the center with the engraving of Vatican, the cathedral in Vatican. And the gold plate itself, there is the address engraved on it. And then surrounding the address are various monuments from Travancore and places of interest from Travancore engraved on it. So caskets, walking sticks, religious icons, relief carvings, and presentation pieces like these were made from Velu Achari's workshop. But what happened to this particular artifact is also interesting, because the Diwan, Sir C.P. Ramaswamy Iyer, was very happy to accept this gift. But on his way back, he presented this artifact to the museum collection. So it was housed in the Napier Museum collection, but unfortunately, it was lost. So alongside the Industrial School of Arts and the private institution like the ones run by Velu Achari, we do come across institutions like these, the Travancore Ivory Carvers Cooperative Alliance, which was established in 1944. And on the left side, you see a photograph of O. Velayudan Achari. He is known as O.V. Achari. He had a prestigious studio by the name O.V. Arts in Paravangadi. And O.V. Achari was the man who is responsible for this Travancore Ivory Carvers Cooperative Alliance. Now, what's the history behind the alliance? What we can see is that after the First and Second World Wars, the quality or the craftsmanship associated with ivory craft went down because there was a great demand for ivory curios and artifacts in the market, because a lot of Europeans, even the soldiers who were coming here, they used to take home the souvenirs made of ivory. And due to this demand, this great demand of ivory artifacts, many small workshops came up all around the fort area, but mostly concentrated around Paravangadi and Palayam. And at one point during the late 1930s, 40s, 50s, you would see ivory shops or shops selling ivory curios in these places. Many shops, numerous shops were there. And so some of the craftsmen associated with the craft, ivory craft, were concerned. And they decided that the finest of the craftsmen should unite. They did, and they established the Travancore Ivory Cooperative Alliance in 1944. Here you see on the right the emblem designed by O.V. Achari. And who were the members of this alliance? As I mentioned, the finest craftsmen in Trivandrum were members. And many of these craftsmen came from the original guilds associated with the Travancore royal family. For instance, on the extreme right is seated Padmanabhan, the son of Neelakandan Achari, grandson of Kochukunya Achari. And on the left, standing, you can see Velu Achari. You can, in the right, in the center, you can see Ramakrishnan Achari, who was a talented artist who started as an ivory carver, but later he was greatly influenced by Raja Ravi Verma, and he went to Madras and studied art and became a painter. So you have people like O.V. Achari, Padmanabhan Achari, who belong to the old guilds coming together. And they made designs, they supervised the craftsmen who were working in these small workshops, hoping that their supervision will bring in some sort of change in the quality of the artworks. And the man who is sitting right in the center is K.R. Ravi Verma, the nephew of Raja Ravi Verma. K.R. Ravi Verma was also a very famous artist who was trained in J.J. School of Arts, and he was the president of this alliance. So you have eminent people like this coming together and trying their best to revive the quality of the craft. So what were the artifacts they were producing? So you have these photographs from an album maintained by the Alliance. These photographs are from 1950s. On the left, you see these wonderfully ornate icons of Hindu gods and goddesses. And on the right top, you see decorative pieces that is known as the elephant bridge. It has nothing to do with mythology or the Dhyana sloka or iconography. It's just an ornamental piece. And then you also have small busts of the national leaders like Jawaharlal Nehru and Mahatma Gandhi. So that indicates the changed political situation during the 1940s. So the craftsman and the craft itself was transforming and imbibing the changes that were taking place in and around Travancore. So as I mentioned earlier, Paravangadi and Palayam had the largest concentration of shops or craft shops selling ivory curios. Here are some advertisements. You can see the Crown Ivory Art House in Main Road, Trivandrum, the SK Arts and Ivory Works in Paravangadi Main Road. Now this is the Ivory Art Center in Palayam. And now the next institution that we will be looking at is the SMSM Institute, or the Sri Moolam Shashtiyabdamurti Memorial Institute, which was established in 1917 to mark the 60th birthday of Maharaja Moolam Tirunal Ramavarma. And this building is located right behind the Secretariat in statue. And the story of the last star craftsman that we will be discussing here starts from SMSM Institute, or rather his early career starts from Velu Achari's firm. So as I mentioned, Velu Achari identified the finest of the craftsmen and employed them in his workshop. And a small boy joined his workshop during 1930s. That small boy's name was Vishwam. You see Vishwam here as an elderly gentleman. So from Velu Achari's workshop, he learned the nuances of ivory craft, and he transformed into one of the finest craftsmen in Thiruvananthapuram. But he came not from the traditional guilds. He came from a family of carpenters from Kollam. And therefore, he was not immediately accepted by the master craftsmen, the other master craftsmen who had been associated with the royal atelier. So therefore, it was very hard for young Vishwam to find commissions. And according to a story shared by his brother, there was a man named Krishnamurti, who was the secretary to Travancore government, a very influential person in Travancore administrative system. He was placed in Thiruvananthapuram, and once he procured a piece of ivory, and he was in search for a craftsman to make him a figurine of Sri Krishna. Now this Krishnamurti had a friend, Chidambara Iyer, who worked in the public library. Chidambara Iyer had seen Vishwam and his work and was quite confident that the young lad would be the best person to carve out the figurine of Krishna. So Vishwam was introduced to Krishnamurti, but Krishnamurti was initially suspicious. It's a small boy who is standing in front of him, and he was reluctant to offer the commission to Vishwam. But Chidambara Iyer succeeded to convince Krishnamurti, and that is how Vishwam got his first commission. And he was given a workspace, and that workspace was accommodated in a side of this compound, because the SMSM Institute, it was established in 1917 to encourage the crafts, but all the craftsmen were associated with the Industrial School of Arts and Sri Moolam Fine Arts run by Velu Achari. So nobody was interested to go there and work in SMSM Institute. So it was converted into a library. So Krishnamurti gives Vishwam a small shed and asks him to use that space. And he creates this wonderful image of Sri Krishna. And Krishnamurti, when he sees the finished product, is convinced about the great talent of C.S. Vishwam and makes him an employee at SMSM Institute. And therefore, C.S. Vishwam, I want to focus on C.S. Vishwam in the last few slides, because he is a craftsman who did not hail from the traditional guilds. He lived through a very unique timeline. That is, he was born in 1924. His early career started during 1930s. During 1940s and all, he used to work for the royal family, work for the aristocrats, and after independence, he was introduced to a different kind of clientele. So here you see C.S. Vishwam, trained by Velu Achari, and a man who was closely associated with the aristocratic or the elite class. For instance, even during 1960s, the royal family had commissioned C.S. Vishwam to carve this ivory bust of Maharaja Swadhitirthan. And I should also mention that C.S. Vishwam finds mention in the biography of Veena Balachandar, the very famous Veena practitioner, because Veena Balachandar always had his Veenas, the ornate pieces, the headpiece of the Veenas made by C.S. Vishwam. And his Veenas were embellished with ivory, inlaid with ivory. And all those works were done by C.S. Vishwam. And here you have Mahatma Gandhi and Jawaharlal Nehru, made for the Gorky Center and exhibited in the Gorky Center in Moscow. And on the left, you see the ivory figurine of Trivikrama, which won the National Award for C.S. Vishwam. It was made in 1968, and that is a replica of a relief carving from Shuchindram temple. And on the right, you see the very famous Menaka he had made, and it was presented to the Japanese ambassador to India. I wanted to place these two artifacts, the photographs, in the same slide because you get to see the range of the craftsman. On one hand, he was well versed with the traditional Dhyana slokas and the Hindu iconography, and made wonderful pieces, replicas and pieces like these, like the Trivikrama and other religious icons. And on the other hand, he was greatly influenced by what was happening elsewhere. He looked at European art. He was influenced by Raja Ravi Verma. That influence is felt in his works. and he produced all these genres. And here in the last slide, you see newspaper cuttings, again pertaining to the life of C.S. Vishwam. On the left, you see him accepting the national award from V.V. Giri. And here is an exquisite casket that he has made with a figure of goddess Saraswati. And if you look carefully, just in front of goddess Saraswati are two lotus buds. And in the lotus buds, embedded in that bud is the Eഴുத்தாணி or the stylus that was used by Tunjat Ramanujan Ezhuthachan, the father of modern Malayalam language. So that will give you an idea about the range of the great craftsman. And before I close this presentation, I would also like to bring your notice to some other important aspects regarding ivory carving, because ivory carving is today an extinct craft. Because you see all these wonderful artifacts, you get to see the details of the craftsmen and all these wonderful things, but there is another side to ivory carving, because for long there has been a lot of resistance against this craft, and people wanted to prohibit the sale of ivory artifacts and the export of ivory. And what I learned is that after the First and Second World Wars, ivory trade declined and the craft also declined. And the Wildlife Protection Act of 1972 actually put restrictions in the trade and craft regarding ivory. And at the same time, we see that African ivory was available in India, and African ivory was procured mostly from Gujarati merchants. They opened their shops here in Thiruvananthapuram. But in 1977, government prohibited trade in articles made using Asian ivory as well. And in 1986, the government banned the sale of ivory and ivory carvings made from Indian elephants. So by 1991, the government banned import, carving, sale of artifacts from Indian as well as African ivory. So that put an end to a tradition which goes back to the time of Swathi Tirunal. And what is most interesting is that the craftsmen here in Travancore, or the guilds associated with ivory carving, graciously accepted this transformation. In the book, I make a comparison with the Sangharia craftsmen of Diu. The Sangharia craftsmen used to make artifacts out of ivory and tortoise shell. And they also worked on African ivory. But when these raw materials were not available, they shifted to acrylic as the medium. So if you go to the Sangharia Sheri, or the traditional settlement of these craftsmen in Diu, you can still see small workshops where craftsmen make the same bangles in the old pattern, but it looks like ivory, but it is not. It is acrylic. In Rajasthan, the craftsmen shifted to bone carving. When ivory was not available, camel bone carving was prevalent there, and now they concentrate mostly on that material. But here in Kerala, things were different, because even with the ivory craft was practiced by certain guilds or families, not by all the craftsmen, because the Orthodox believed that ivory, after all, comes from an animal and there is some impurity associated with it. So not all the craftsmen were willing to work with ivory. So instead of ivory, these craftsmen went back to their old ways of carving in wood and sandalwood. Okay, so therefore, by 1900s, we see that the craft of ivory carving, which thrived first in the Royal Atelier and through institutions like the Industrial School of Arts and the Alliance, and the various shops that you would see in Palayam and Paravangadi, everything vanished and it became an extinct craft. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Sharat Sunder, for a wonderful presentation.
Can I will stop sharing my screen.
Yes, absolutely.
Is it time for question answers?
Yes, it is.
Okay, but thank you very much, Sharat Sundar, for your very powerful and explicit empirical investigation into the ivory carving craft and its present state of affairs. My name is Michael Parakan. I belong to the KCHR. I have a question to ask you. You talked about the crafting abilities, skills being learned by people from not strictly the same old category of people, but people
Yes.
from outside too. I was wondering whether have you come across someone called Mathus Mestiri? His real name was Matthew. He is from Valiyathura, and he was even when he was a young school student, he was born in 1900. He was very keen on learning the ivory ivory craft, and he used to go and hang around the streets of people who are working on this, and they also came to know him as somebody who will spend his school time looking at their work. And finally he asked them whether they would let him learn it. First he was discouraged, saying that he came from the fisher people's community. He had absolutely no tradition of craft, the tradition of ivory carving or any type of carving. So first he was discouraged, but ultimately he was allowed to learn. And in the 1920s, he's supposed to have started, he left the original group, and then he obviously had his own problems while learning because his own colleagues wouldn't be very happy with it. But ultimately he left that and started an institution called Britannia Handicrafts and Ivory Works in Valiyathura. And Valiyathura at that time was a booming town by itself. It was a major port. It's only in 1947 and a bad accident happened and the Valiyathura port was stopped. Up to that, Valiyathura was a booming town. And not only that, his present biographers claim that he found out a new market for the ivory carving. Earlier, it was mainly meant for the aristocrats and royalty, mainly the Travancore royalty and other people like that. But he could sell it to the people who come from abroad, European people. particularly to Valiyathura. And also, he could also make uh, statues of Christian gods, Jesus Christ, and and sell it. And one of his major item was beads, making the rosary. Christians, when they say their prayers, they use a kind of a rosary, and rosary beads was one of. And couple of his books are available, account books, and those books do show that he started with 4 people, and ultimately in 1940s he had a workforce of 80. That must have been at the height of his. Unfortunately, this Matthias dies in 1955, and there's a claim that he was awarded by the Maharaja the Best Craftsman's Award for exhibiting a work of his in a Delhi exhibition, but they could not trace it. Many people say that they've seen it in his workshop, and of course he is also credited with having made a statue, most possibly an imitation of the Pietà, Saint Michelangelo's Pietà, or the Pope in 1953. So this is what, of course, there is a very interesting biography of an article, biographical article by Robert Padipilla called Theerayora Charitrathila Tirisheshippugal. Is really talking about people of one of the most backward communities in.
Sir, I have not come across any references to this particular person, but what is interesting is that I had a slide where I had shown 4 images of the 4 children of Neelakandan Achari, and those 4 siblings, they were associated with the Industrial School of Arts, but they had their workshops attached to their home, and they had their ancestral home in Peta and Palkulangara regions. Many people belonging to different castes, from the Latin Christian community, from the Irava community, and even Nayars also came to study in these workshops. And what is interesting is that one of the brothers, Ramakrishnan Achari, he was also employed in the School of Arts, but every evening after work, he would walk down to Paravangadi Street, and there was a very famous ivory arts emporium by the name Mohini Arts. And Mohini Arts was run by a Irava aristocrat who was based in Thotam near Muttatara. And that was the place where Ramakrishnan set up a mini workshop to train people from out, especially for the people who came from outside the craftsman community.
Yeah.
Okay, so what I got to know is that Iravas were the first who were probably attracted to ivory carving, because some of the wealthy Iravas had supplied these craftsmen with African ivory, and gradually some members of the Irava family, they showed some interest in the art and learned it with the masters. And in fact, when I was doing my research, I came across a particular group of people who were very reluctant to reveal their identity, because according to the locals, they were known as the Irakkamalar. Now, what does Irakkamalar mean? It is the Irava and Kamala community. So it seems that the ivory craft, or the Irava community's aptitude in ivory carving eventually led to the members of these communities being engaged in marriage alliances, and they were known as the Ira Kamala. So likewise, from the Latin Christian community, from Valyathura, several people came to learn ivory carving, and the same Ramakrishnan Achari who taught people from outside the caste is said to have he was regularly taken to a church. I don't have the exact details, but according to the oral sources, it was located in Valyathura. And he was the one who painted the icon for the festival there. So it is very clear that there was a strong association between these communities, and probably the person whom you had mentioned must have learned it from the masters themselves. Actually, I haven't seen this article. I would like to go through it and do further research on this.
Thank you, Sharat. May I request those who are asking questions to wait until the written questions have been read out, because that actually helps us save time. Pasha, could you just read it out, please?
Okay, madam. We have first question by Madhu Votri. Shastamangalam procession, Huzur records, and Danda, a few words need some explanation.
Okay, Shastamangalam procession.
Huzur records, Huzur, and Danda.
And
D-A-N-D-A.
Danda. Okay.
Danda.
Those terms.
Which requires the words need some more explanation.
Okay, so Shastamangalam procession was a procession that was associated with the Travancore princely, the royal family. It is said that the Kubakara Potis who were associated with the Atrayogam, they had abode here in Shastamangalam, quite near to the temple that is still there in Shastamangalam. And every year the Maharajas of Travancore ride out on a state procession to visit the temple and to meet the family. So that is the Shastamangalam procession. So Shastamangalam procession, like the Pujapura procession, was celebrated with great pomp during the princely rule. And regarding the other terms, Huzur records are actually the administrative records. So basically you have two important records pertaining to Travancore in the archives here. You see the Madilagam records that is associated with the day-to-day running of Padmanabha Swami temple, but that is those records are clearly associated with the temple. But the Huzur records are administrative records where you will find the details of royal commissions. In the case of my research, I was mostly interested in the royal commissions because important commissions like the construction of the golden chariot and the state ivory state chair, etc., was thoroughly detailed in these Huzur records. Now, Danta is the vernacular term for Dantam, that is ivory. So I mentioned Danda Apis. So Apis is office. So Danda Apis is the place or the work space where these early craftsmen who were patronized by the royals, they worked in the Danda Apis, or their workshop was known as the Danda Apis. I hope it is clear.
Thank you very much.
Okay, next question by Dr. Vijay Verghese. I have slightly deviant question. Elephants were used for multiple purposes and carried varied meanings. It was also one of the symbols of royal power in Travancore. Given this, can you speak a bit about political economy of ivory production or harvesting and an underlying historical consciousness about wildlife and conservation in Travancore?
I think I'm not an expert on some of the topics mentioned in the question, but I can certainly speak about elephants being used in Travancore and also in Sri Lanka. Generally in India, now elephants claim a major what elephants are always there associated with royalty because of the power. And it is also used in religious processions, and even going back to Buddhism, we have a very strong connection associating Buddhism with the elephants. So it is not surprising that in Sri Lanka and in Travancore and in the south, elephant is seen in religious iconography or other ways, or associated with the royal establishment. And regarding the ivory that was harvested in Travancore, if you look at the early records, we see that the ivory used by the craftsmen who worked in the Danda Apis, or later on who were employed in the Industrial School of Arts, they got the ivory from the royal treasury. So the government actually had a system of procuring ivory from elephants in with the private owners, and also from the elephants that were maintained in the royal stable and in the Devasam. And all this ivory, the tusks would be removed from the elephants. Once the elephant is dead, the tusks would be removed from the elephant, and it would be taken to the and deposited in the royal treasury. And according to the need of the craftsmen, through proper request from concerned authorities, for instance, for the Industrial School of Arts, if you are commissioned to make a certain artifact, then a request should be sent to the treasury by the superintendent of the Industrial School of Arts, mentioning the quantity of ivory needed and the purpose. And that amount would be issued from the royal treasury. And along with this, there is something interesting, because I mentioned about the ivory from the royal treasury and the ones procured from the merchants who supplied the local craftsmen with African ivory. And African ivory was known as, in vernacular terms, it was known as kadu dandam. Kadu means katti. It was hard. So it was hard ivory. Why was it hard? According to the local craftsmen, they classify ivory into two. That is the kadu dandam, which is the hard ivory, and the jiva dandam. This is most interesting, because the ivory extracted from a elephant, a living elephant, is considered to be most auspicious. And even today we have we trim the tusks of elephants. Once in a year or in a couple of years, the tusks will be trimmed, and the sections removed will also go not to the treasury, but to the workshops of these very important craftsmen, who would be asked to make artifacts out of it. And what artifacts were made out of Jiva Dandam? It was always religious artifacts. Pendants were made, rings would be crafted out of it, and icons like Krishna, Ganapati, and Hindu icons would be made from it. so what is special about Jeevadandam is that people believe that since it is removed from a live elephant, there is the soul of that animal trapped inside the Jeevadandam. It has Jiva. The essence of life is still there. So it was considered auspicious, and it was easy to work on. It was not as hard as African ivory, because according to the local craftsmen, African ivory was procured from Africa, and it took a long time for these traders to bring it to Kerala. And by then, the whatever moisture content in the tusks would be gone, making it too hard. So I hope I have shed some light on certain things you had asked, but otherwise I am not an expert to answer all your questions.
Next question by Vani. Is there any comments on the presence of the pineapple motif in some of the artifacts?
Pineapple motif, as of now, no, because when I was doing my research, I did not have that kind of access to the original artifact itself. Now that is very important, and I think I should mention this, because many of these artifacts, I got a photograph, that too not a great photograph of the artifact, but there was some restrictions imposed on close inspection and study of the artifacts, and it was quite recently that I managed to do some editing on the photographs and find out that the detail that you see on the side panel is that of the pineapple. So more research needs to be done, and probably pineapple, I don't know if somebody had thought pineapple to be an exotic fruit, because in the making of this ivory artifact, it was not the work only of the traditional craftsmen associated with the royal court. They of course carved the panels, but from where they got these got the inspiration, or from where did these symbolic representations come from? This is all very interesting, because these craftsmen, they were working during 19th century, early 19th to mid 19th century. They were of course exposed to the Western trends and Western iconography and Western art. They must have seen lithographs coming from England with the angels and cherubs and all the Christian icons and all. Interestingly, some of the winged angelic icons that you see carved on the side panels can be seen in paintings produced during that time in the court atelier by the court artists, and also in some of the woodwork that was done in the palace complex. So what I think is that these craftsmen derived inspiration from a lot of things they saw, their context, and they just reproduced it. But the pineapple icon, I am also most interested. I will search for it, and if I get an answer, then I will write about it, and I will share an article in my blog.
I remember reading somewhere a long time ago, but you should check this, that it came from Golconda and via Goa, and it's the Qutub Shahis. So there's a very interesting sort of history of travel, of food, and the way in which the motif then gets incorporated within different kinds of traditions. So it may be worth checking.
Yeah, certainly a lot of influence came from Tanjavur also, because we do have references from the Huzur records regarding craftsmen coming to Swati's court from Tanjavur. So if you look at the Kudira Maliga, that is the palace constructed by Swathi Tirunal, it is not a pure traditional kind of Kerala architecture you see there. It's a hybrid style. You see traditional Kerala elements, along with that you have colonial elements, and then you have certain elements which are not unique to Tanjavur, like the bay windows, but probably the bay windows came from northern part of India. It came through Mughal influence. It traveled down to the Arcot Nawab's region, and then maybe Tanjavur and all these places with lot of Muslim influence. And from there, it comes to Swati's court. And what we see is that these elements are incorporated, directly taken and being incorporated into various buildings. So if you go to Pujapura, you have the Vijay Vilasam Palace, where you have Ambari Mukhappa kind of bay window. You go to Kudira Maliga, you see the same bay window. And I do believe that it needs to be verified. I do believe that the bay window that we see even in Padmanabhapuram Palace complex was either constructed or modeled this way during the time of Swati, because the palace was extensively renovated by Swathi Tirunal. So this is very interesting. These connections and influences and cultural exchange is something that should be looked at in great detail.
There is a raise hand option by Jose. May I ask the question now?
There's a question from me also, Pasha.
Okay, this is Jose, if I may.
Yes,
Yes.
yes, yes.
Yeah, I have two questions. One is there any connection between the Ivory Carvers of Trivandrum with the ivory carving community of West Bengal and Orissa? Because there are some ivory carving happening in West Bengal, and there seems to be a connection between these two communities. So is there a connection? I have one more question, but I would like to get this answer first.
Yes, regarding this question, I haven't seen any records, or even from oral sources, I haven't come across anything to establish a connection between these craftsmen. The problem with the historical research regarding the craftsman community is that this was a marginalized community, and you find very few written records about the craftsman community, and it was very, very difficult to find out the details, like the names and the family names of some of the early craftsmen. So in that case, connections between craftsman communities which are located far away, like in Travancore and West Bengal. I know that West Bengal was in fact very famous for the ivory crafts, and there were several other places as well. I have not come across any connections. So that's my answer, Jose. No, I don't think I have seen any connection there. Even when I went through the Huzur records, there are craftsmen coming or visiting the Travancore court. They come from different places, mostly from the southern parts of India. But who knows, maybe someday we will get something from the Huzur records.
Well, I was asking this question from a different context, because I have been studying a bit about I'm from the other side, I should say. I study the wildlife trade, and I came across with some close connection between the Travancore ivory carvers and the West Bengal carvers. And even in the 2014 to 2015, 3-4 years when I studied it, I have found out that there is a lot of exchange happening between these two carving communities. Where people from, but it is not historically. So I was very curious that is there a connection? Is there a training, or there is a technique which was shared between these two communities? Because the West Bengal carvers got a different style of carving, and the carvers from South India got a different style of carving. So it was very, very interesting. And also some connections were with the Jaipur carvers also. So they all talk about carvers from southern India, especially from Trivandrum. So I was wondering whether there is any historical connection between these two communities. The other question is that, as a form of art, it is very beautiful. I'm not from an art background or anything, but what can be done to, I don't think I would like to hear the word extinct when it comes to this rich cultural tradition and art. So how can we preserve this art? Can we not look into modern methods like modern material like epoxy or acrylic? Because both materials are used by carvers extensively to make replicas of ivory statues. And why don't we look into that kind of an option and preserve the art part of it? Of course, we can debate about the ivory trade and all. That's a different topic altogether. But how can we protect this art form of art? Because otherwise, in another couple of decades, I think this will disappear totally, because the training is not happening. People are not training. So how can we conserve it?
Okay. First, regarding the connection, you mentioned that the craftsmen, even in Jaipur, had some kind of association with the Travancore style of ivory carving. That was not clear, but I would like to bring this to your notice that West Bengal, I have no idea. Even stylistically, it is quite different from what is practiced in southern part of India. In southern part of India, the early work was mostly based on the Hindu iconography. So the craftsmen strictly followed the dhyana slokas for making the idols and all those things. So that regarding the making of sacred icons, everywhere the craftsmen would have followed the same methodology. But regarding Jaipur, I don't know, but certain craftsmen from Travancore had traveled to northern part of India, and it happened mostly during the time of Sarti Madhav Rao, because Sarti Madhav Rao resigned as the Diwan of Travancore in 1872. And he was placed in Indore for some time, and after that he went to Baroda. So according to the Huzur records maintained here and in the Baroda Palace archives, we see that certain craftsmen and artists, of course, the famous example is Raja Ravi Verma being invited to Baroda court. But along with Raja Ravi Verma, you have several artists like Thiruvenkada Naidu, even Ramaswamy Naidu, who was the rival and early contemporary of Raja Ravi Verma, and the Neelakandan Ashari, who I had mentioned in this presentation. We do have records of Neelakandan Ashari traveling to Baroda and staying with the Diwan. And what is interesting is that the 10 artifacts he had produced were lent to the exhibitions by the Diwan. So I don't know for how long Neelakandan stayed there in northern part of India, but these artifacts they had made were being sent to most important exhibitions throughout India and even outside India. So the craftsmen of West Bengal and even the craftsmen in Jaipur and various other places, even though not connected to the craftsmen community in southern part of India, they would have known the kind of work that is being done there, and maybe they would have worked on replicas as well. So that is probably one of the reasons why you get this connection. Regarding the next question, I had mentioned that if you go to Sangharia Sheri, Sangharia Sheri is the Sheri or the settlement of the Sangharia craftsmen in Diu. There, I saw that the craftsmen are still making artifacts like they were making 100 years back. The pattern has not changed. If you look at the artifacts also, you will in first go you will think that it is ivory, but later on when I talked to the craftsmen, they told me their story, and they, after the ban on ivory and tortoise shell came, they started they shifted to acrylic, like you mentioned. They shifted to acrylic, and regarding the craftsmen who were based in Mysore and Travancore, they went back to carving in wood, because they primarily were carpenters. All these people who, like the Kochukunyachari and the Neelakantanachari I had mentioned, and even the Velu Achari, the visionary I had mentioned in the presentation, all of them were carpenters. And it was only in the mid or the early decades of 19th century that they got introduced to ivory carving, or ivory carving was greatly patronized during that period. So ivory carving was known to Kerala craftsmen and these indigenous craftsmen communities, but there was not a separate group who were engaged with ivory carving. It was often taken up by the carpenters, and according to some sources, even the goldsmith community used to do ivory carving. So when the ban came, most of them were happy to go back to the old raw material, that is wood. Okay, and even in Thiruvananthapuram, during my field work, I came across a family who came to Thiruvananthapuram sometime during 18th century as stone masons from Tirunelveli. And later on, they became carpenters. And from being carpenters, by 1900s, they went to Mysore. One of the brothers went to Mysore, and that is my great-grandfather. He went to Mysore because he came from a different group. He was not part of the old guild. So he was not accepted probably by the old school craftsmen. He went to Mysore, learned ivory carving, came back, and his brothers became renowned ivory carvers. So mobility within these groups, they could change their this craft or trade. So this is all important. So yes, with the ban, most of them reverted to the or different materials like bone. But like you mentioned, acrylic is a very good medium. And I do think that ivory that is procured from archaeological excavations, like the mammoth ivory and all, are available. It is that ivory is available for craftsmen, but considering the amount of raw material you get, it is a very scarce material to work with.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much for the wonderful presentation. And I just ordered your book online, and hopefully will connect with you directly for further discussions. Thank you very much for this.
Next question by Professor Ironima. Do the family histories and interviews that you have done, that is given the scanty nature of the information in the Huzur records, tell us anything about the details training youngsters in the craft? Were those who were trained in carving, that is wood and ivory, also taught painting, or was that other guilds? Tanjavur, for instance, had distinct painters' guilds who painted the portraits of Kochugunyu Ajari and Neelakanta Ajari, and there are those of Neelakanta Shastri's sons. All of these are realistic. So were these done later from photographs? Do we know?
Regarding the training, during my initial research and interviews, I came across certain documents preserved in some of the old houses, which documented certain aspects of the craft. training. But otherwise, what I learned from the senior members of the Craftsmen Guild was that they did not have a proper systematic kind of schooling for the crafts. If a boy is born into the guild, by age 7 or when he is age 9, he would accompany his father and the team, and that is when you learn the basics. So that is something we see with the carpentry class. But with regard to the ivory craftsmen, unlike the other carpenters or the stonemasons, did not move to different places. That is, when a temple is being constructed by the royal family, a particular spot is selected, and then the craftsman will be invited to that particular place. So craftsmen come from different places. For instance, for the reconstruction of Padmanabha Swami temple, according to records, we see that craftsmen came from Valliyur, from Tirunelveli, and many other places in Tamil Nadu, and also from Tiruvalla and places in Kottayam. And so you have craftsmen coming to Thiruvananthapuram and engaging in that grand project. But with regard to ivory carving was mostly patronized at royal courts during the initial phase. So Travancore Royal Court had this atelier, and as far as I know, the people who were initially associated with this craft were the local craftsmen. And there too, they took their children with them. We have no recorded history about this, but oral sources tells us several interesting tales of children being taken along with their father or uncles or relatives. And regarding ivory carving, the basic thing that they would be taught is they will be given a small piece of ivory, and they would be asked to carve out an elephant or a human figure out of the small piece using a tool which is known as kadir. It is different, slightly different from the normal chisel that carpenters use. It's a very delicate kind of tool because ivory is very delicate and you should be very careful while handling ivory. These children are taught right from a young age to work with this material. They were never given a full piece of ivory. They usually got to work with small leftover pieces because ivory was expensive. So that was the kind of training they got. And what is interesting is that there is this oral tradition about a lady, Narayani Ammal, that's her name, daughter of Kochugunyachari, daughter of Neelakantanachari, granddaughter of Kochugunyachari, who was introduced to the nuances of carving. She, in fact, knew how to carve, and she used to carve figures, but not like her siblings or the family members. She did not go out and practice the craft. But what is most interesting is that her son, K. Madhavan, went on to become one of the greatest artists in southern part of India. And in fact, he is known as the Norman Rockwell of India. He was the father of, he is considered to be the father of this cutout commercial cinema and commercial art. So he is the son of Narayani. So we come across various interesting oral traditions, but sadly, there is very little information available. And regarding painting, from very olden days, the craftsmen who were involved with carpentry, those who worked with stone, those who worked with the metals, they had a basic aptitude towards drawing. But the ones who were associated with stone works and carpentry works, I think, were the ones who exhibited great interest in fine arts, because to carve something, first you need to draw out that pattern. So it was most essential for this craftsman to learn drawing. And when the Industrial School of Arts was established in 1888-89 period, and Kashi Narayan Iyer came back from Madras, he started this fine arts section. And we see that the people, the students who enrolled for this course mainly came from the craftsman community. But what is interesting is that they finished the course, and if you look at the census, you see that maybe 500, maybe 100 students enrolled for the fine arts course, but you will find only 5 people practicing fine arts or earning their livelihood out of fine arts. Why does that happen? Because since most of these students came from the craftsman community, they always looked at fine arts as a sidekick to their main profession. They wanted to learn geometry, they wanted to make good drawings, but where will they apply it? They will use it for ivory carving and carpentry works. They will never become another Ravi Verma or Ramaswamy Naidu. But very few artists or students from that generation decided to turn their back on ivory carving and went on to become famous artists. That is the man I had mentioned, Ramakrishnan Nachari, who was born in 1888, started his training under his father Krishna Nachari, who was the craft instructor at the Industrial School of Arts, and the craft instructor was the one who supervised the ivory carving section. So I had the fortune to go through the log books maintained by Krishna Nachari, and there his son is also listed as an ivory carver. But later on, his son turns out that he was not interested to become or to follow that tradition, but he was mesmerized by the life of Ravi Verma and achievements of Ravi Verma. So he went to Madras not to study carving, but he learned fine arts, and he came back and became an artist. So you also asked about the portraits. These portraits, unfortunately, I have not seen the original painted portraits. What I got to see were photographs taken sometime during 1950s. The original portraits are lost, but these portraits probably came from, these paintings were probably done by either the artists who were there within the family, because Neelakandan, it is known that Neelakandan Achari, the son of Kochukunja Achari, was a very good artist, and his children were also very good with fine arts. And in fact, there are many old houses in and around Thiruvananthapuram where you will find religious icons painted by the children of Neelakandan Achari. So they were into painting. Some of them excelled the use of oil paint. Some of them used to paint using tempera, various mediums they used. Some used watercolor. I have also seen watercolor sketches and other paintings done by these craftsmen. So probably these portraits were made by the members of the guild itself.
Fascinating. Really so interesting.
No more chats are found in the chat box. So it's a time to wind up the session. Professor Arunima, anything to be added?
Yeah, I want to thank Sharat Sunder Rajiv very warmly for having spent this time with us and talked us so patiently through this very intricate and very, very interesting history with such amazing detail. I mean, it was like looking through Da Vinci's notebooks or something, thinking about your going through their logbooks and so on. So absolutely fascinating talk. Thank you so much. Come back again. And I will certainly be in touch with you for things that interest me personally. Thank you so much, Sharat. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sharat.
Okay, on behalf of KCH, sincere thanks are extended to Professor Sharat Sunder Rajiv for a wonderful presentation, for a wonderful and interesting presentation. And thank you everyone for your active participation. Thank you.